I'm 74 years old, and I want to tell you about the day I finally put down something I had been carrying for 50 years. I didn't know I was carrying it. That's the part that took the longest to understand. When you carry something long enough, when you have been carrying it since you were a child, it stops feeling like a weight and starts feeling like just the way things are. Like the temperature of the air, like the sound of traffic. Something so constantly present that you stopped registering it decades ago. What I was carrying was this, the weight of what other people thought of me. Not in the dramatic, obvious way that word sounds, not obsessively checking, not paralyzed with social anxiety, nothing that would have been visible from the outside. I was functional. I was, by most measurements, confident. I moved through the world without any obvious signs of the thing I'm describing. But underneath all of it, underneath the confidence and the opinions and the forward motion, there was a constant low-level process running. Monitoring. Calculating, managing, asking, before almost every significant choice, almost every honest word, almost every moment of genuine self-expression. What will this look like? What will they think? Is this the version of me that is safe to show right now? 50 years of that process, running quietly, costing me things I couldn't see it costing because it was always there. And then, at 67, it stopped. Not all at once, not through a single dramatic moment of liberation. It stopped the way most real things change, slowly, then completely. And what was left when it stopped was something I had not felt since I was very young. Something I had almost forgotten was possible. I felt like myself, actually, fully, without performance or management, or the slight gap between who I was and what I was showing, like myself. And I want to tell you what that feels like, and more importantly, I want to tell you what the 50 years before it cost me, because you are paying that cost right now, today, and you may not even know it. But before I go any further, if anything I say today lands in a place that feels true, please like this video. Share it with someone who is still living inside what I'm about to describe, and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. These are the conversations I needed at 30. Every share means they reach someone who still has time to act on them. It takes 2 seconds, and it matters more than you know. Now, let me tell you what I used to believe. I believed that caring what people thought was something I could think my way out of. That if I just became successful enough, confident enough, accomplished enough, the need for approval would naturally dissolve. That self-assurance was something you earned by achieving things. That if I built enough, proved enough, demonstrated enough, eventually I would stop needing the validation and simply have it. I spent 30 years testing that theory, and it was wrong in a way that took me a long time to fully accept. Because approval is not a thirst that gets quenched by drinking. It is a thirst that gets stronger the more you feed it. Every time I made a choice based on how it would look rather than what I actually wanted, every time I held back something real because I wasn't sure how it would land, I reinforced the mechanism. I made it more central to how I operated. I practiced it without knowing I was practicing it until it was as automatic as breathing. I believed that the people whose opinions I was managing were actually thinking about me as much as I thought they were. This is perhaps the most expensive of all the beliefs I held. The truth, which I now know with the clarity that only comes from age, is that most people are far too occupied with managing their own version of this same problem to be thinking about you with any sustained attention at all. The audience I was performing for was almost entirely imaginary, and I spent 50 years in costume for a show that nobody was really watching. I believed that the version of me I was showing the world was close enough to the real one that the gap didn't matter, that the small adjustments I made, the things I didn't say, the opinions I softened, the authentic reactions I replaced with more acceptable ones, were minor, negligible. The cost of living in the world with other people. The gap was not minor. It had become, over decades, the central fact of my life. Does that sound like anyone you know? Does it sound like you? The shift began, and I want to be precise about this because I think precision matters more than drama. Not with a revelation, with a subtraction. I was 63. My wife became seriously ill, and in the weeks that followed, the hospital visits, the rearranged life, the confrontation with what actually mattered versus what I had been treating as if it mattered, something very quiet happened. I ran out of energy for the performance. Not all at once, but gradually, as the genuinely important things consumed more and more of what I had, the less important things simply fell away. I stopped having the spare capacity to monitor how I was being perceived. I stopped having the bandwidth to manage the gap between who I was and what I was showing. I was too occupied with something real to maintain something performed. And in that space, in that exhausted, grief-adjacent, stripped-back version of daily life, I noticed something unexpected. The world did not fall apart. The people who mattered didn't leave when I stopped managing my image for them. My honest reactions, even the ones I had always edited, didn't destroy anything. The things I said without filtering them through the usual process of how will this land, they landed. Sometimes awkwardly, sometimes uncomfortably, but they landed as mine. And there was something in that, something I had been starved of without knowing I was hungry, that felt like coming up for air. I started paying attention to that feeling, even after my wife recovered, even after the acute crisis passed and life returned to something more ordinary. I kept noticing the difference between the moments when I was performing and the moments when I wasn't. And the difference was not subtle. The performing moments were exhausting in a way I had normalized so completely I had stopped feeling it as exhaustion. The non-performing moments were lighter, more present, more, and this is the only word that fits, real. And then I started to see the pattern underneath it, the full shape of what had been happening across the whole of my life. I started to count the choices I had made based on how they would appear rather than what I actually wanted. The career decisions shaped partly by what seemed impressive. The opinions I had held back in rooms where holding them back felt safer. The relationships I had maintained, partly because ending them would have required explaining myself in ways I wasn't comfortable with. The version of myself I had presented so consistently, capable, composed, certain, that I had almost forgotten it was a version. And underneath all of those choices, underneath 50 years of management and monitoring and the careful maintenance of a particular image, I found something I hadn't expected. I found a person who had quite strong opinions he had been keeping quiet, who had genuine preferences he had been overriding, who had things he wanted to say that he had been editing for decades, who had been, in the most fundamental sense, performing rather than living. That person had been there the whole time, waiting, with the patience of someone who has learned that their moment rarely comes. His moment was now, and I had almost missed it entirely. What version of yourself have you been keeping in the background? What have you been editing before it reaches the room? And here, if this is resonating, please take 1 second, hit like. Share this with one person who is still spending energy on what the wrong people think. Subscribe if you haven't. These realizations took me 63 years. These videos take me a week. Knowing they reach you makes that week worthwhile. Let me tell you what caring too much about what people think actually cost me. Not in theory, in the specific, daily, accumulated reality of a life spent partially in performance. It cost me my real opinions, not the big political ones, those I expressed readily enough. I mean the small, daily, genuine reactions to things, the honest response in the meeting I replaced with the diplomatic one, the thing I actually thought about the decision that I kept to myself because the room didn't feel safe for it, the observation I swallowed because the timing wasn't right, and the timing was never right, and so the observation was never made, year after year, until I had trained myself to produce the acceptable version before the real one even fully formed. It cost me relationships that could have been real, because real relationships, genuine ones, the kind that sustain you, are built on the honest version of you, not the managed one. And I had given most of the people in my life a managed version, carefully constructed, consistently maintained. And because they had only ever known the managed version, they could only ever be close to that version. The closeness was real, but it was closeness to a performance. And some part of me, the part that was watching from the background, was always slightly alone inside it. It cost me decisions I should have made differently, because when you are partly living for the perception of others, you do not make decisions purely on the basis of what is right for you. You make them on a weighted calculation that includes how they will look. And some of the most important choices of my life, about my work, about my time, about where I put my energy, were influenced by that calculation in ways I only saw clearly in retrospect. I chose impressive over right more times than I want to count. And impressive over right, accumulated across a life, produces a particular kind of dissatisfaction that is very difficult to name, because the life looks fine from the outside. It cost me decades of energy, the monitoring, the calculation, the constant low-level process of managing perception. It is genuinely exhausting in a way that you can only feel clearly once it stops. I had been tired for years without knowing what I was tired from. When the performance finally stopped, when I finally ran out of the capacity to maintain it, what I felt underneath was not emptiness, it was rest. A rest so deep It felt like the first real sleep after a very long night. Now I want to speak to you directly, honestly, without the softening I would have added 10 years ago. How much of your daily energy is going toward managing what people think of you? Not the obvious cases, not the performance reviews or the first impressions you know you're making. The subtle ones. The way you tell the story of your weekend to make it sound more interesting than it was. The opinion you don't share in the group because you're not sure how it will land. The choice you're considering right now that you haven't made yet, partly because you can't quite work out how to explain it to the people in your life who will have something to say about it. How much of you is going into that, and what is not getting that energy as a result? Because here is what I know at 74. The people whose opinions you are managing the most carefully, the ones whose imagined reactions have the most influence over your choices, most of them are not thinking about you with the intensity you are thinking about them. They are managing their own version of this same problem. They are running their own monitoring process. They are editing their own authentic reactions before they reach the room. You are performing for an audience that is also performing, and both of you are exhausted. And neither of you is living the life you would live if you stopped. What would you do differently if you knew, genuinely, felt in your body, knew, that nobody whose opinion actually matters would think less of you for it? Here is what I know now at 74. After the illness and the exhaustion and the gradual, irreversible discovery of what was underneath the performance, the freedom from other people's opinions, the real version of it, not the bravado version people perform on social media, but the quiet, actual version, is not something you arrive at by becoming indifferent to people. That is not what happened to me. I care about people. I care, if anything, more than I did before, more genuinely, more specifically, with less performance in the caring. What changed is not that I stopped caring about people. What changed is that I stopped confusing the people with their opinions. I stopped treating what someone thought of my choices as a verdict on my value. I stopped outsourcing my sense of whether I was living correctly to people who were not in possession of the full information about my life, people who had their own angles, their own fears, their own unexamined processes shaping their reactions. Their opinion was always about them as much as about me. I just couldn't see that from inside the performance. And here is what was waiting on the other side of that understanding. What I found when I finally stopped spending energy on the management. I found that I had actual preferences, strong ones, about how I spent my time, about what I was interested in, about the kind of conversations I wanted to have, and the kind of life I wanted to live. Preferences I had been partly overriding for decades in favor of the version that would be more easily understood or more readily approved of. They had been there the whole time, waiting. I found that I had more energy than I had felt in years, because the monitoring process, the constant low-level expenditure of managing perception, had been consuming more of me than I had ever accounted for. When it stopped, what came back was not just the energy it had been using. It was a kind of clarity. a directness in my own experience of my own life that I had not felt since I was young enough not to have learned the performance yet. I found that the people worth keeping drew closer when I stopped performing. This is the part that surprised me most. I had assumed, the performance had been built partly on this assumption, that the edited version of me was more likable, more acceptable, that the real version, unmanaged, would create distance. It didn't. The people who were genuinely for me responded to the real version with something I can only describe as relief, as if they had been waiting for it, as if the performance had been keeping something between us that neither of us had known was there. And the people who preferred the performance, who needed the managed version, who were comfortable only with the edited reactions and the softened opinions and the careful maintenance of a particular image, those people found me, gradually, less easy to be around. And that information, uncomfortable as it was also clarifying. It told me something true about what those relationships had actually been built on. Here is the warning, given to you now at 74 with everything I know. You will spend your life performing for people who are also performing, managing your image for an audience that is managing its own, editing yourself for reactions that are themselves edited. And the years you spend in that process, the specific, irreplaceable years, are years you are not spending being actually alive in your own life. The liberation I am describing is not comfortable. The moment when you stop performing is the moment when you have to confront what was underneath the performance, the real opinions, the genuine preferences, the version of you that the performance was protecting, both from other people and from yourself. That confrontation is uncomfortable, and it is the most worthwhile thing I have done. You do not have to wait until 63 for a crisis to strip the performance away. You do not have to wait until you have run out of energy for the maintenance. You can choose to put it down. Not all at once, that is not how it works, but one choice at a time, one honest word at a time, one moment of saying what you actually think, in a room where you would normally say the safer thing, and watching what actually happens. What actually happens, almost always, is nothing catastrophic. What actually happens is that you feel, briefly, unmistakably, like yourself. And that feeling, built one choice at a time, is what I am living inside now, at 74. Later than I should have found it, but not too late. You still have time to find it earlier than I did. Please use it. If this reached something in you today, share it with someone who is still spending the best of themselves on people who aren't worth the energy. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment. Tell me about the moment you stopped caring what someone thought. Or tell me what you would do differently if you knew the audience wasn't really watching. I read every comment, every single one, and I will be here with more to say. There is always more to say.